Welcome to History in the Shadow. I am your host Shahu. Jonah was told it would take 3 full days to walk across it. 3 days. Not across an empire. Not across a country. Across a city. And the corridors of its palace. The palace that its king called, with no irony whatsoever, the palace without rival. Were lined room after room with carved stone images of impaled prisoners, burning cities, and captured kings displayed in cages outside demolished gates. Think about what that means. A city so large that walking from one side to the other took 3 days. A palace so vast that it covered more than 4.5 football fields. A library so comprehensive that when archaeologists finally dug it up 2,500 years after it was burned, they found over 30,000 clay tablets, the largest collection of written knowledge that the ancient world had ever assembled in one place. And built by a civilization that put its prisoners on stakes and recorded the results on the walls of its palace corridors. Both of these things are true simultaneously. The only way to understand Nineveh is to hold both of those truths at the same time without flinching from either. And here is the fact that makes it stranger still. The fire that destroyed Nineveh in 612 BCE also preserved it. The wooden shelving of the library burned. The building burned. But the clay tablets, heated by the fire, were baked harder than they had ever been. 2,600 years later, an archaeologist brushed the dust from one of those tablets and found the cuneiform text still perfectly legible. The destruction preserved the evidence. Nineveh operates on that principle. This is the story of what Nineveh actually was. Not the symbol, not the abstraction. The city, the streets, the houses, the bread, the beer, the law, the slavery, the library, the water system, the palace corridors, the fall. Let us start the main story. Stand for a moment at the outer approach to Nineveh in the year 700 BCE. You are coming from the west, from the direction of the Tigris River floodplain. The road is wide enough for military columns to march 5 across without breaking stride. On both sides, the ground has been deliberately cleared and leveled for hundreds of meters. Nothing to hide behind. Nothing to obstruct the view from the towers above. You are meant to be seen from a long distance before you arrive. That is not an accident. And then the wall appears. Nineveh's outer defensive walls stretched for approximately 12 kilometers around the city's perimeter. They were built of fired brick over a stone foundation, rising between 25 and 30 meters, with towers set at regular intervals rising even higher. In places, the wall stretched 45 meters wide. Outside it, a moat. Inside it, 150,000 people. 150,000 people. In the 8th century before Christ, before Rome was a significant power, before Athens had built the Parthenon. Nineveh was the New York City of the ancient world. At 15 points around this wall, Sennacherib's engineers cut monumental gateways, each one named for an Assyrian deity. Each gateway was flanked by the lamassu, enormous carved limestone figures, winged bulls with human faces, 4 to 5 meters tall. Their bodies shown in profile, but their faces turned directly to look at whoever was approaching. Every delegation arriving at Nineveh had to pass between these figures, had to look up at their enormous carved faces, and absorb a single unmistakable message. The forces that protect the city are not entirely human, and the being who commands them is watching you enter. Then they walked through the gate, and the city swallowed them. The Kosor River ran through the city's interior, fed by the canal system built to manage water flow and distribute fresh water to the palace gardens and neighborhoods. The streets closest to the gates were wide enough for loaded wagons, but within a few hundred meters they narrowed into the irregular lanes and alleys of the residential city, because Nineveh had existed as a settlement long before the Assyrians made it their capital. Archaeological excavations have shown that the city has its origins around 6000 BCE, 6,000 years before Christ, before the wheel, before writing. People were living on the site of what would become Nineveh. By the time Sennacherib chose it as his primary residence, the city already had a history of more than 5,000 years. The temples at Nineveh were not new constructions. They were ancient institutions with roots stretching back before the empire that now controlled them. When a worshipper entered the Temple of Ishtar in 700 BCE, They were entering a sacred space that had been continuously maintained for longer than most civilizations had ever existed. And here is the detail that almost nobody mentions. The city of Jonah and Nahum, the city of blood and sin and violent empire, was also, in the same breath, a city of libraries, botanical gardens, mathematical astronomy, and hydraulic engineering that was genuinely extraordinary. It was both of these things simultaneously. And the only way to understand why the biblical writers reacted to it the way they did is to understand both. The Kuyunjik Mound, excavated by Layard beginning in 1845, yielded one of the greatest archaeological finds in history: 30,000 clay tablets, the largest known collection of written texts in the ancient world at that time. Among them were astronomical records, medical texts, divination manuals, literary epics including some of the earliest surviving copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh, mathematical tables, and administrative documents spanning centuries. Mathematics, botany, chemistry, astronomy precise enough to track planetary movements across decades. The library was built the way Nineveh built everything, through conquest, through forced relocation of Babylonian scribes, through the systematic extraction of the ancient world's accumulated knowledge. The city that put prisoners on stakes built the world's first great library. That is the city we are walking into. Imagine a house on one of Nineveh's residential streets in the mid-7th century BCE. The exterior presents itself as a long, unbroken mud brick wall, windowless at street level, with a single wooden door set into a stone socket worn smooth by decades of daily use. Privacy in the ancient Near East was architectural. You built your life inward. Pass through the door and you enter a short entrance corridor. Turn the corner and you arrive in the courtyard. The courtyard is the house. Open to the sky, it provided light and air to all the surrounding rooms. Women ground grain here in the early morning. Tools were sharpened in the afternoon. Animals, a donkey, perhaps a few goats, were kept in the lower rooms adjacent to the courtyard. Several Assyrian homes from this period show evidence of narrow internal channels built into the mud brick walls themselves. A ventilation system that drew cooler air from the lower courses of the wall and exhausted warmer air through vents near the ceiling. The temperature outside was pushing 40 degrees Celsius. Inside, the thick mud brick walls had absorbed the cold of the night. This technology is not widely discussed, not generally credited as ancient Assyrian engineering. But the evidence is in the walls. Near the doorway, in a niche in the mud brick wall, a small clay figurine of the goddess Ishtar. Not a luxury item, present in the humblest domestic context. A woman's hand touching it briefly before beginning the morning's grinding. Household religious practice woven into the daily routine. The grinding started first. In households across the residential districts of Nineveh, women began the day's first labor before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, kneeling at the saddle quern, running the upper handstone back and forth across dried barley grain. 2 to 3 hours to produce enough flour to feed a family of 5. Every morning, without exception. This was the foundational labor of the household. The sound of grinding was the sound of Nineveh waking up. Bread was not simply food. It was currency, wage payment, and social obligation simultaneously. The palace administrative records include detailed grain allocation rosters. An ordinary laborer received roughly 1 liter of grain per day. A skilled craftsman, too. A senior administrator, more. These rations were not charity. They were wages paid in calories because calories were the universal form of stored value in an agricultural economy. The bread itself was flat, dense, baked on clay griddles. The constant presence of stone particles ground off the corn surface meant severe dental wear in young adulthood, the biological record of a diet built on stone-ground grain. And then there was beer. Beer was not an occasional indulgence. It was a daily staple, brewed from barley malt, thick, cloudy, consumed through reed straws. Palace records document daily beer rations issued to workers and soldiers in the same administrative registers as grain allocations. It was not a luxury. It was infrastructure. At the level of the palace feast, the food culture became something else entirely. An inscription commemorating the completion of the Assyrian palace at Nimrud describes a 10-day feast attended by nearly 70,000 guests. Thousands of cattle, sheep, fish, bread, beer, and wine consumed in an event that was not a party but a performance of power staged as generosity. a demonstration that the empire's capacity to consume and distribute was inexhaustible. And in the markets below the palace, the smells of this food culture mixed with the smells of animals, human sweat, fermented grain, dust, and dung, the particular sharp odor of a major ancient city in high summer. Nineveh's existence as a city of 150,000 people was an engineering achievement. Beginning around 694 BCE, Sennacherib ordered the construction of an aqueduct system drawing water from mountain foothills roughly 50 kilometers to the northeast. The system included the Jerwin Aqueduct, a stone structure crossing a broad valley on a series of arches over a span of 280 meters. The construction material used at Jerwin included a hydraulic cement mortar made from crushed limestone and water, creating a waterproof bond that has survived in the archaeological record to the present day. This is an application of hydraulic cement technology roughly 2,000 years before the Romans are commonly credited with developing it. And it is almost entirely unknown outside of specialist academic circles. Some scholars have proposed that Sennacherib's garden, irrigated by this remarkable water system, was the original hanging gardens of the ancient world. The famous wonder, one of the seven wonders, may not have been in Babylon at all. It may have been here, built by the same king who lined his palace corridors with images of impaled prisoners. 18 canals brought water to the city. The engineering fed the palace gardens, the temple precincts, and the wealthier residential districts. Ordinary households drew water from the Kosor River or public systems, carried in clay jars by women as part of a daily labor burden that already included hours of grain grinding and textile production. When Assyrian armies conquered a city or region, they did not simply loot and leave. They administered the defeat. The population was counted, categorized, and partially relocated. Administrative tablets record these transfers with the same bureaucratic precision as grain allocations. 3,000 Arameans assigned to wall construction. 500 Israelite weavers transferred to palace textile workshops. After the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE, Sargon II's own annals recorded the deportation of 27,290 people from the city of Samaria alone. Not a round number, not an estimate, a bureaucratically precise accounting of human beings removed from their homes and marched hundreds of kilometers to labor destinations in the Assyrian heartland. Some of them ended up in Nineveh itself. The Hebrew prophet being told to go to Nineveh in the book of Jonah was being sent to a city that was the destination to which his own people's relatives had been deported a generation before. The relatives of Jonah's community were in Nineveh, in the palace workshops, in the textile factories, in the construction gangs. Among the individuals whose names appear in the administrative tablets of Nineveh are people with Hebrew names, listed in allocation records, correspondence registries, and workshop rosters. We do not know their individual stories, but they are there. People who were carried to Nineveh without their consent, whose labor built the walls and wove the cloth and copied the texts of the civilization that had absorbed them. The deportation system was designed above all else to prevent rebellion, by scattering conquered populations across the empire, mixing Israelites with Arameans with Elamites with Babylonians in the same labor context. The Assyrian administration disrupted the ethnic and cultural cohesion that organized resistance required. Stand at the Shamash gate at mid-morning on a market day. Merchants from Syria lead loaded donkeys carrying bales of Phoenician purple textile, a colorant produced from crushed sea snails along the Mediterranean coast, extraordinarily labor-intensive, priced accordingly. Traders from the Arabian Peninsula move through the crowd with sealed clay jars of frankincense and myrrh. A Babylonian grain merchant argues in Aramaic with a toll collector. Cedar planks from Lebanon, horses from Iran, wine from Syria, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, iron tools from Anatolia, fine linen from Egypt. Everything the known world produced, Nineveh consumed. A merchant operating within this system could borrow silver, travel to a distant market, return, sell at a profit, repay the loan with interest, and settle the balance before a scribe and witnesses, the entire transaction documented in clay tablets sealed with cylinder seals. A functioning commercial legal system in a city most people picture as purely brutal. Interest rates ranged between 20 and 50% per transaction. Debt in Nineveh was not simply a financial condition. It was a gravitational force that could pull a free household into servitude. The Temple of Ishtar had been rebuilt multiple times over a history spanning more than a millennium. The daily ritual cycle was elaborate, continuous, and treated with absolute seriousness. At dawn, the inner sanctuary was unlocked. The cult statue was symbolically awakened. Water offered. Clean garments presented. A food offering of bread, beer, and roasted meat placed before the statue. Music performed. Incense burned. The god's presence in the statue was not metaphorical. It was understood as real, literal, and requiring continuous competent maintenance. Missing the morning offering was not a spiritual lapse. It was an administrative emergency with political consequences. The same temple system also controlled large portions of the city's economic life. Temple estates held agricultural land, operated workshops, managed lending operations. The temple and the marketplace were not separate spheres. They were interlocking components of the same economic system. Palace-employed scribes examined the livers of sacrificed animals against clay reference models. They maintained continuous records of celestial observations, tracking planetary movements across decades. They produced written reports submitted to the king as intelligence briefings about the future. These were not informal spiritual consultations. They were formal administrative procedures. Nineveh was a city where the boundary between the material and the divine was managed as a state enterprise. The Middle Assyrian law codes addressed property ownership, inheritance rights, marriage, commercial debt, assault, and theft. They were applied procedures, not aspirational statements. A married woman could be veiled in public, a status marker with legal consequences. Enslaved women were expressly forbidden from wearing the veil under penalty of physical punishment. The law texts specify 50 lashes and the pouring of hot pitch. That was the written legal procedure, recorded in cuneiform on tablets that have survived 2,700 years. But alongside the harsh provisions, the same legal system maintained a written petition mechanism through which ordinary citizens could appeal directly to the king. Archives contain actual clay tablet petitions. A widow whose inheritance had been seized, a merchant cheated, a craftsman whose workshop had been appropriated without compensation. Some were upheld. Some were denied. The machinery of Assyrian royal justice was real and functional within its defined limits. Slavery in Nineveh was not marginal. It was foundational. The palace, the temple, the great merchant houses, the construction projects, all operated on enslaved or coerced labor to a degree that the city's scale would have been impossible without. War captives were the most direct pipeline. Palace records enumerate these allocations in the same administrative registers as grain and oil distributions. Slave prices ranged from 10 to 60 shekels of silver. These are records of specific human beings, people with names, with origins, with histories, reduced to commodity values in accounting documents that have survived 2,700 years. Within this brutal system, differentiation existed. Highly skilled enslaved people, scribes, translators, physicians, master craftsmen, occupied positions of practical authority that bore little relationship to their legal status. An enslaved Babylonian scribe managing palace correspondence could exercise real administrative power over free workers. The gap between legal category and functional reality was one the law could define but not entirely close. Walk now through the palace of Sennacherib. You enter through the outer gate, passing between the lamassu. The corridor is wide enough for 5 people to walk abreast. The walls rise to at least 4 meters, covered from floor to ceiling with carved limestone relief panels, pale slabs depicting the campaigns of the Assyrian king. The reliefs are arranged as a guided story. The army departing, river crossings, the approach to enemy territory, the siege ramps built against the walls, battering rams driven forward, scaling ladders rising, the city falls, and then the aftermath, prisoners impaled on tall stakes, deportation columns marching from burning ruins, the king receiving tribute, scribes standing beside him, recording everything. One sequence depicts Sennacherib's siege of Lachish in 701 BCE. These panels are now in the British Museum. 20th century archaeologists excavating Lachish in southern Israel used these panels as reference material. They found the siege ramp exactly where the carved panels suggested it would be. The relief was not merely art. It was a record. These panels lined the corridors every official visitor walked. Ambassadors, tribute bearers, subject kings, forced by the architecture of the building to see, in sequence, what happened to everyone who resisted. By the time you reached the throne room, the king on his elevated platform, flanked by carved lamassu, surrounded by relief panels of lion hunts and divine protection. You had been walked through a complete psychological curriculum about what this king was capable of. That is the architecture of terror. Sennacherib's royal annals contain one of the most famous phrases in ancient Near Eastern literature about the Jerusalem campaign of 701 BCE. As for Hezekiah the Judean, I shut him up like a caged bird within Jerusalem, his royal city. Not dead, not captured, a caged bird. Still alive, still on his throne, unable to move while the Assyrian army controlled everything outside his walls. The biblical account in 2 Kings describes the same campaign, the same cities falling, the same tribute paid. But then the army withdraws, 185,000 soldiers struck down in the night. Two independent records of the same events, written by opposing parties, converging on the same core facts without ever agreeing on the interpretation. That is what genuine ancient history looks like. And Sennacherib's own fate was recorded in both the Bible and the Babylonian Chronicle. In 2 Kings 19 verse 37, the text states that Sennacherib was struck down while worshipping in the temple of his god, killed by his own son. Two records, two origins, one event. The palace reliefs created by a man murdered in his own temple by his own family. By the late 7th century BCE, the empire was fracturing. Military campaigns requiring continuous mobilization, draining agricultural manpower. Internal succession conflicts following the death of Ashurbanipal around 627 BCE. In Babylon, Nabopolassar seized control in 626 BCE and began building a military alliance. The Medes joined under Cyaxares, an Iranian highland people subjected to Assyrian raids and tribute demands for generations. Together they formed a combined force the Assyrian military system had never faced, sufficient organization, motivation, and resources to sustain a siege of the world's most heavily fortified city. In 612 BCE, the combined army moved against Nineveh. The Babylonian Chronicle recorded the fall. In the month of Ab, the city was taken. A great defeat was inflicted upon the population. The Assyrian king was killed. The city's wealth distributed among the victors. Nineveh burned. The destruction layer is visible in excavation. Burned mud brick, collapsed roof timbers converted to charcoal, smashed pottery. The palace reliefs were deliberately defaced. The faces of the rulers removed from the walls. And the library, over 30,000 clay tablets survived precisely because of the fire. Baked harder by the flames. Shattered but legible. Lying entombed for more than 2,500 years until Layard's excavations in the 1840s brought them back into the light. The city was abandoned within a generation. When Xenophon marched his army along the Tigris Valley in 401 BCE, less than 200 years after the fall, he described the mounds beside the road without recognizing what they were. He passed the ruins of the largest city on earth and saw only undifferentiated hills. Nahum had written, "Woe to the city of blood, full of lies, full of plunder, never without victims." By 600 BCE, every word was literally, geographically, archaeologically true. Jonah was commanded to go to Nineveh and warn it. He refused and fled in the opposite direction. Because for a Hebrew prophet in the 7th century BCE, Nineveh was the specific, identified, documentable capital of the empire that had dismembered the world he lived in. His people's relatives were in the palace workshops. The relief panels showed what happened to cities that resisted. Jonah's flight is not spiritual cowardice. It is an entirely rational response. And when Nineveh repents and the announced destruction does not come, Jonah's response is one of the most honest moments in prophetic literature. He is angry. "I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, I knew what mercy aimed at Nineveh would look like, and he found it intolerable. The text ends with a question, not an answer. Should I not be concerned about Nineveh, that great city, in which there are more than 120,000 people who do not know their right hand from their left? The ruins of Nineveh lie today beneath a suburb of Mosul in northern Iraq. The Kuyunjik Mound is there. The partially reconstructed Nergal Gate stands at the mound's edge. The Lamassu are in museums in London, Paris, and Chicago, millions of visitors walking past them every year. The same figures that watched everyone enter the most powerful city on earth, now watching museum visitors. Their carved human faces turned directly forward. The same message implied. The tomb of Jonah stood on the mound that contained the ruins of the palace of the king Jonah, had been commanded to warn. For more than 1,000 years, pilgrims came to honor the prophet at the physical location of the city he had fled. In 2014, ISIS demolished the shrine, bulldozed it, and in doing so exposed the ruins of the Assyrian palace beneath. The ISIS tunnels dug beneath the shrine inadvertently exposed previously unknown sections of Sennacherib's palace. New inscriptions, new reliefs, new evidence, the destruction that exposed the ruins, the fire that baked the tablets, the violence that preserved the evidence. Nineveh operates on that principle across every era of its history. The Babylonian Empire that destroyed Nineveh in 612 BCE was itself destroyed by Cyrus of Persia in 539 BCE. The Median Empire that provided the other half of the coalition also dissolved. And Nineveh, burned and abandoned, but its library baked hard, its reliefs buried, its engineering surviving in the archaeological record, outlasted in physical evidence most of the civilizations that followed it. The ordinary people of Nineveh who never appear in the records, the craftsman and the weaver and their children, their names never in the administrative records except perhaps in a tax list. Their lives not documented in the library or the annals, but present, grinding grain, carrying water, maintaining the household figurine of Ishtar, buying bread at the gate market, the foundation on which everything else rested. The Tigris Valley today is unchanged in its physical geography. The river flows through the landscape it has occupied for 10,000 years. The mounds are visible at Mosul, the agricultural plain on the opposite bank, the mountains to the northeast where the Gomel River heads toward the Jerwin Aqueduct site, the landscape that held the most powerful city on earth for 250 years, unchanged while everything else has changed. A museum visitor in the British Museum Assyrian Galleries today stands before a clay tablet mounted in a display case and reads the English translation beside it. The words pressed into wet clay in Nineveh in the 7th century BCE reaching this person in a London museum. The connection across 2,700 years made possible by the fire that baked the tablets. The library of Ashurbanipal speaking to the present through the medium of its destruction. When God asks Jonah at the end of the book whether a city of more than 120,000 people does not deserve concern, people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, the reader who knows Nineveh's history is not reading a comfortable theological abstract. They are reading a question about whether the ordinary people grinding grain and hauling water and sleeping in mud-brick houses on narrow residential lanes, people surrounded by a system they did not design and could not escape, whether those people belong inside the circle of divine concern or outside it. That is one of the most serious questions in the history of religion. And Nineveh, the most violent city in the ancient world, the city of blood and palaces and libraries and aqueducts and impaled prisoners and clay tablet petitions from widows seeking justice, is the city that made the question necessary. That is what Nineveh was. That is why it still matters. That is why the question it forced into the world has not yet found its final answer.